When is it to happen, and for what purpose, or what is the purpose of the tribulation? These are all legitimate questions, I understand, but let's begin by joining Jesus and his disciples as they are going out of the temple. Now, the temple, as I stated, was made of many buildings, and the disciples, I believe, were excited about this temple. And by the way, it was still in they were still working on this temple when they were there. It was Herod's temple that he was building, not Solomon's. Solomon's has been torn down by the Babylonians, and now Herod is trying to reconstruct and redo and build another temple. The disciples were wanting to show Jesus around, but Jesus takes over. In verse 2, he tells them about what is to happen, and with this, they're put in a state of shock, I believe. He's talking about, and let's look at verse 2 again. It says, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." But not only that he brought up, he had also told them that he was going to go away, and he's trying to set the stage of what's to happen in just a short time following this. Jesus, when he's talking to the disciples, they just can't make sense out of what is going to transpire here. So the disciples, they're all by themselves now with Jesus. They came to this certain place, and they're by themselves with him, and they ask him three quick questions. And these questions are, when shall this happen? When shall this temple be destroyed? And Jesus here in Matthew does not give us, or Matthew's account does not give us the answer to that. But I want you to turn over with me to the book of Luke, Luke's Gospel, in chapter 21. And this is the same incident, but now Luke is going to fill us in on Jesus' answer to their question. In verse 20, here's what Luke shares with us. Chapter 21, verse 20, "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." It's soon to happen, in other words. "Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains." Get away from this. Run for your lives is what he's saying. "And let them that be in the midst of it depart out. And let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress," Matthew said great tribulation, "but great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive unto all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled." Jesus gives them a clear understanding here of what's to take place. We read this and we know that in AD 70, that's exactly what happened. Nero and his armies came, and they literally this ravished the entire land. They done such a good job that even over there today, you go in and you can still see the devastation of what took place. Their second question is, "What shall be the sign of thy coming?" And the answer to this, Jesus gives us in Matthew chapter 24, picking up with verse 27. And let me read down to what he says about this to answer this question. Here's what's the signs that's going to happen. "For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For whatsoever or wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with great a sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now learn a parable of the fig tree, he says. When the branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the door. And he goes on to talk more about this, but I'm going to stop right there and just say that Jesus gave very, very clear understanding of the signs that they were to look for. Then they want to know the end of the age. When will all of this come about? And Jesus gives this, beginning with verse 4 of this chapter and going down through. And I want to read this again because I want you to see some things here. Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. In other words, it's going to be a day of deception, and you be careful that you're not deceived by the many that's going to be bringing false teachings about this. And he goes on, he said, for many shall come in my name, saying, I'm Christ, and shall deceive many. And even today, we know that there are those that, and I got me a bug here, there are those that are trying to deceive people from taking them from the truth and giving them stories that are just not true at all. And ye shall hear of wars, Jesus said, and rumors of wars. See that you be not deceived, for all these things yet must come to pass, but the end is not yet. And he tells them about nations rising against nations and kingdom against kingdoms, and pestilence and earthquakes in strange places. And all these things, he said, is the beginning of trouble, or beginning of sorrow. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. And we know that as we look back on Israel's history, some of these things have happened. We know that there's been deception. We know that we've seen those that have said that they were the Christ, and all of these things have happened. But right today, what we're seeing is these things are intensifying all around. But let me just stop right here and interrupt myself and tell you this. This is Jesus teaching, not to you and me so much as teaching his disciples. Who's he talking to? He's talking to Jewish people. And I want to say to all of us tonight, it's not in our place to be looking for signs. And I know people want to see signs, but that's not what God told us to look for. We are to be listening for a sound, and that sound is the trumpet that's going to sound one day, as Paul writes to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 51, and also in writing to the church of Thessalonica. He says, let not your heart be, don't be led astray on starting to worry and concern yourself about the happenings that's happening all around. Because he says that we're to look up, because and we've been told this throughout the scriptures, that our redemption is nearer than it's ever been, and I believe this to be true. Now, when we think about the tribulation, I want to set the stage for this and go back to when it's first mentioned. And the first mention of the tribulation, we got to go clear back to the 4th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. And I want to take you there tonight, because this is the first time that we hear of the tribulation. In chapter 4, down in verse 30, I think it's 30 that I'm wanting. Yes, in verse 30 of chapter 4, when thou art in tribulation, Moses writes, and all these things are come upon thee, even in the, notice, latter days, if thou turn to the Lord thy God, and shalt be obedient unto his voice, for the Lord thy God is a merciful God. He will not forsake thee, neither destroy thee, nor forget the covenant of thy fathers, which he sware unto them. So here Moses, well, let me read on here. For ask now of the days that are past, which were before thee, since the day that God created man upon the earth, and ask them the one side of heaven unto the other, whether there hath been any such thing as this thing is, or hath been heard of it. Did ever people hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as thou hast heard and lived? Or has God essayed to go and take him, a nation, from the midst of another nation by temptations, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by mighty hands, and by a stretched out arm, and by great terror, according to all that the Lord thy God, your God, did for you in Egypt before your very eyes? Now, Moses is laying out his case here, and he's telling the people, you see, as God has taken care of you thus far. By the way, when we read this is a strange thing about this passage, that Israel had not even been in the promised land yet. And here is Moses looking around the experiences that they're going to have in going into the promised land, and all the glory days that are out there before them with King David and what he is going to accomplish, how that God is going to lead them into the promised land by the hand of Joshua, his servant, and the glory days of Solomon when he builds the temple and all of this. Here's Moses looking around all of that, and he's looking clear by the Spirit of God, I believe, giving him these instructions, and he's looking beyond to a time of tribulation. He says in the latter days, and he's talking about the tribulation that's yet even to come. Now this was, you go back thousands of years, and Moses is laying out what's going to happen. Now the nation would experience and has experienced, I'm talking about the nation of Israel now, some terrible times, but not what they are going to go through in the out here in the future. It's not happened even as yet. Go back to Matthew 24, verse 21. We read this, and then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. What Israel is going to experience is something that it's very, very painful to even read about, because when we see what's going to happen during the tribulation period, I know this, as I read the Bible, and I've seen how that people, it got so bad in Israel's history that women would take and cook their own children and eat their own children to keep them starving to death. During the tribulation period, so things like this is going to transpire again. It is going to get bad. Before I frighten anyone, let me say again that this passage is not given to us as a church, and I'll show you this in just a moment. But the tribulation is going to be after the church is raptured out. Now let me get to this. The prophets describe this time as a time of wrath, of judgment, indignation, trial, trouble, destructions, darkness, desolation, overturning, and punishment. All of this is laid out in the prophets. Go back to Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, in chapter 2. let me just read some of this, and you listen for some of those words that Isaiah will use here. In chapter 2 and verse 19, and they shall go into the holes of the rocks, talking about this period of time, and into the caves of the earth for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake terribly the earth. This is talking about this time of tribulation. Isaiah goes on in chapter 24 of this book to talk about this period of time. Let me give you some scriptures here. Chapter 24 and verse 1. Here we read again. If I can find the right page here. Get the right chapter even. In Isaiah chapter 24. I brought this Bible because I thought I could get through it easier. In chapter 24, verse 1 says, "Behold, the Lord maketh the earth maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. The land shall be utterly emptied and utterly spoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word." Verse 6 goes on to say, "Therefore the curse devoureth the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are buried, and few men left." Going on over to verse 19, "The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and thou shalt be removed like a cottage. And the transgression thereof shall be heavy upon it, and it shall fall and not rise again. And it shall come to pass," verse 21 says, "in that day that the Lord shall punish the host of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth." We sometimes question why is all this writing that we have in our Bible, the prophets, what are they talking about? And here we know that this is all giving us instructions as to what's going to take place out there in the future. Chapter 26. In verse 20, Isaiah goes on to say, "Come, my people, enter thou into thy chambers, shut thy doors about thee, hide thyself as it were for a little moment, until the indignation be overpast. For behold, the Lord cometh out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity, and the earth also shall disclose her blood, and shall no more cover her slain." And I could read on and on some of the other passages that talks about this time of judgment that's going to come upon this earth. But let me come down to I could go to the prophecy of Joel. I will mention this, and Joel, just a little 3-chapter book, but he talks about destruction and gloominess and thick darkness that's going to come, and his prophecy is about this time of the tribulation. Jeremiah calls it a time of Jacob's trouble, or we know that Jacob is another name for Israel, and it's a time of Jacob's trouble. And Jeremiah called it, he goes on to say that there will never, no more, be a day like it. And that's what we read in Matthew 24. Daniel tells us that it's going to be a time of trouble as never was there since there was a nation, the nation of Israel, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. We move over to the New Testament, and we come to the book of Revelation, and in Revelation chapter 6, verse 16, let me read what John is going to tell us in this particular passage. And it's talking about the tribulation. Verse 16 says, and said unto the mountains and rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? As I read there in the book of Matthew, it says, except those days be shortened, no flesh could be saved. And the future holds, I believe, the darkest days yet. They're on their way. I know this to be a fact because this is what the Bible is telling us. Now, let me point out, I asked the question of when shall this be? Can we know when the tribulation is going to begin and when it's going to end? And I believe we can with the Word of God. I happen to believe the Bible is laid out in dispensations. In other words, let me just give you a quick rundown of the dispensations of the human governments. The first dispensation was called the dispensation of innocence. That's when God made man here and put him on the earth. Adam and Eve were created. And it began with, at that time, man was innocent. He knew no sin at that time. He walked and talked with God, communicated with God, and he lived in an innocent world in an innocent time. But you all know what happened. God made one stipulation. He put a tree, and he said, thou shalt not eat thereof, and in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Now, that wasn't, a command like that. You say, well, why did God lay that out like that? Why did he tempt Adam? God didn't tempt Adam. The Bible says that God tempteth no man, and neither can God be tempted. But he gave Adam that stipulation, you'll not eat of that tree, and in the day that you eat thereof, thou shalt surely die. We know that Adam ate of the forbidden fruit, and what happened? He was put out of the Garden of Eden. He brought sin into the world, and he was expelled from the garden. So that the dispensation of innocency had a beginning, it had an end. And then the next dispensation that come on is called the dispensation of conscience. It began with the fall of man, when Adam was expelled from the garden, and then there was the time of conscience. That was back before the law. There was no law for man. Moses was going to be the lawgiver. He's going to bring the law in, and he's a long way down the road. So man lived according to his conscience, and we hear this all the time. A person will just live their conscience, and I think that's what people are doing today, trying to live their conscience. But it began with the fall of man, and it had an end. It ended with the universal flood in Noah's day. Remember, here was this generation of people, and probably millions of people were here upon this earth, maybe even more than millions, maybe up in the billions of people, because they were living longer and they were producing, and families were coming at a rapid pace. But when we know that when it all started, here was Noah. And when God was looking and had Noah, the man of this righteous man out there preaching that judgment was going to come and get ready for it, Noah stood there preaching day in and day out. Some try to say that he preached for 120 years. Perhaps he did. I challenge anybody to prove that from the Bible. We know that he worked on that boat and worked on that boat, and it does say that it does mention the 120, but doesn't say that he preached that long. But we do know this: out of all of his preaching, that Noah only had no more than 7 converts, if he had them. We know that his wife was saved. He had 3 sons that believed and trusted in what Noah was preaching, and their wives. And you think about this vast earth that we live on, the age of conscience started with the expulsion of man out of the garden, and it ends with the flood. And when the flood came, just 8 people on this whole vast earth that we live on today with billions of people, there was just 8 people left. And that's when the age of conscience was over. The third dispensation was the age of human government. This started with a man by the name of Abraham. No, I'm sorry, I take that back. It started with the Noah covenant. God gave Noah a covenant. Anyone know what that covenant was? What did God promise through Noah? What was that? Never destroy this world by flood again. Now, I know it's got a lot of water on it a lot of time, but it will never be destroyed again by water. And God made that covenant with Noah that he would not destroy it again. Well, this age or dispensation ended with the multiplication of tongues at the Tower of Babel. We read about that in the 11th chapter of the book of Genesis. Here's what was taking place. I'm trying to rush as quick as I can. The people, God looked down. Let me just take you back there and read what really transpired at this time. God looked down, and he in verse. Let me begin reading with verse 4. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach into the heavens, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth." This was the idea of man. We got to get together now and try to keep our interest all together and stay together. And the Lord came down, it says in verse 5, to see the city and the tower which the children of man builded. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one. They have all one language, and this they began to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do." They were trying to build a tower that was going to reach into heaven. And let me just prove tonight that what the Lord was saying here is possible. You think what man has done, and I remember standing right here in this pulpit way back years ago and telling that man will never get to the moon. I said, when man gets to the moon, you come and tell me about it, and I'll apologize to you. Well, guess what? I had to do some apologizing. Man did make it to the moon, and man he's still not satisfied. He's wanting to go on and on and on and on. And we see what the mind of man can do. All we have to do is pull out your telephones out of your pockets now, take pictures with them, record on them, and do all of these things. They blow my mind. I remember and somebody gave me a Bible, all 66 chapters of the Bible, and they gave it to me on a little old clip about that big. And I thought, man, how could anybody improve on that? Well, man has improved on it and continues to improve on it. But God, notice what it said. The Lord said, "Behold, the people is one. They have all one language." And God said, "Let us go down." Who was God talking to? Well, it was the Godhead. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit said, "Let us go down and let us confound their language." You want to know why there's so many languages in the world today? It's because God done this to slow man down a little bit. God made us so remarkable. I look at myself. You can look at yourself and think the complexity of the human anatomy, the body of a human being, and see what God has done just by the word of his mouth. He created man from the dust of the ground and put this thing called a brain up here between our ears, and the mind of man, there's no stopping it. And God said, let us go down and confound their language. And so this, the multiplication of the tongues at the Tower of Babel stopped the Noahic covenant. The fourth covenant was the patriarchal covenant. We come to chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, and there we read about a man by the name of Abraham. And God made a covenant with Abraham when he called him. He said, he called him out of the Ur of the Chaldees, which is over in Babylon. And he said, I want you to go. And Abraham went looking for a city whose builder and maker is God. And God made a covenant with Abraham. He said, I will bless them that bless thee. I will curse them that curse thee. And I'm going to multiply your seed as the dust of the ground, as the sands of the sea, as the stars of the heaven. All of this, God made a covenant and promise to Abraham. And by the way, God made that promise to Abraham, and no place has it ever been taken back by God. I will bless them that bless thee, curse them that curse thee. And I believe with all my heart that the reason why we came out of the Second World War as victors is because of the way that we harbored the Jew and took up for the Jew. And I believe that was the downfall of Adolf Hitler and those that went the other direction. Now, this patriarchal covenant started with Abraham, and it ended with the nation of Israel. Abraham's seed happened to be the children of Jacob. And remember, they went down into Egypt. 70 souls went down into Egypt. 430 years later, they came out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses, and this ended the patriarchal dispensation with the people, well, actually coming out of Egyptian bondage. And they didn't come out with just 70. In that 430 years, they expanded their nation to well over 2 million people. And they're still growing as we speak. The fifth age was the age of law. It began with the coming out of Egypt, and when Moses gave the law, this dispensation continued. Now listen, continued for thousands of years up until the Messiah came, whose name is Jesus Christ. When Jesus came and lived here for 33 years upon this earth, he went into Jerusalem. Remember riding on the foal of an ass, donkey? He goes in, and the people, as he's going along, they're saying, hail, glory. They were praising him, singing praises to him. But one moment they were singing praises, and before he even gets to Jerusalem, they were crying for his scalp, so to speak. They was crying out, crucify him, crucify him. And here's the matter in a nutshell. He came into the world, and his own received him not. And because they didn't receive him, the age of law was set aside. And this brought on the next dispensation, a dispensation that we are all a part of today, and that's called the church age. Now, I'm bringing out all of this to make you see and understand that every one of the dispensations that we've covered and that we're going to cover, it had a beginning and it had an end. I believe the church age started on the day of Pentecost. I've said this before. There was 120 people walked up into that upper room as individuals. They come into the upper room, and there on the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came down. And I believe the church age had its birthday. The church had its birthday. And there's going to come a time, while we're in the church age right now, there's going to come a time when this age is going to consummate. It's going to be over. When will that be? It will be when the last child of God is born. The last one that's going to be a part of God's family comes to faith in Jesus Christ. And that could happen tonight. That could happen anytime. And when is this age going to come to a close? It's going to come to a close when the rapture takes place. And I've talked about the rapture a couple weeks ago when Christ comes back out there in the air and the church is going to go home. I'll mention again in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we're told that the trumpet's going to sound, and that we're going to go out of here. This mortal is going to put on immortality. This corruptible is going to put on incorruption, and then death is going to be delivered up in victory. Also in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul writing there, he says, I want you to be encouraged in the fact. Don't be discouraged, because the dead in Christ is going to rise first, and then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds, talking about the rapture. And this could happen at any time. Every dispensation had a beginning and had an ending. Well, let's come to the tribulation. When will the tribulation begin? Now, there's some that are divided on this. I've studied as best I know, the best men that I know to study after, to give the truth as to when the tribulation is going to take place. I personally believe it will take place following the rapture of the church. Now, will it take place the very next incident after the rapture? We don't know. I wouldn't even argue that point. We do know this, that when Jesus came riding into Jerusalem and the age of law had its consummation, when they rejected him, it was they took him and crucified him, and it was 50 days following his crucifixion that the church began. You see, the tribulation period does not have to begin the incident that the rapture takes place. I know there's some things that has to be done in the tribulation period. There has to be a temple rebuilt. And right now, as I said, we're not to look for signs, we're to listen for sounds. But if you turn your television on and you find out that our president has said that we're going to put our embassy over in Jerusalem, and Israel is taking a stand, and people are getting all uptight about this, arguing on both sides. Israel has come back to be a nation. Back in 1948, Israel was recognized as the new nation here. And remember when they came back? Why is it that they came back and didn't ask for a king like they had before? I'll tell you why. Because they got a king. They rejected their king, and they're not going to have a king. That's the reason why you've got a prime minister over there heading up Israel. But their king is going to come. But before he comes, they're going to have to go through some difficult times. I'm out of time tonight, but let me just mention this. This period of, we know how long it's going to last. The Bible makes it very clear. The book of Daniel, chapter 9, we're told that it's going to last for 7 years. And Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, it tells us there's 70 weeks that are determined upon the people, thy people, it says. And that's, of course, talking about the Jewish people. These 70 weeks represent a time period of 70 weeks of years. So that's 7 a week, 7 days, times 70, and that gives us 490 years is supposed to, this is determined. Well, all we have to do is go back in the Bible and learn when this time period started. And it began with Nehemiah that I preached on this morning, and it started there. And when 6 weeks of the 70 weeks was consummated, or 69 weeks rather, this happened when Jesus come riding into Jerusalem on that donkey. And remember, right there, this dispensation was, whether you call it a dispensation at this point, but it ceased to be. And the next thing that's going to be on God's clock is that timepiece is going to start ticking again, and the last year, the 69 years is already come and gone. The 70th year is to begin. Now, in that 70th year, it will be in 7 years that's going to take place in the tribulation. I'm trying to find a place to stop here. And going back to Revelation, let me just point out a couple things here, and I'll close tonight, and we'll get back maybe to this again. But in Revelation chapter 8, let me, I'm sorry. I want to go to chapter 11. Here, John is given some insight on what's to take place. John said, "And there were given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein, and the courts which is without the temple, leave out and measure it. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. 42 months equals, they have a 30-day month in Israel, and that's what God's going to go at. 42 months equals to be 3.5 years. That's how long they're going to tread underfoot this time. And I will give power, Jesus said, to my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260, that's 60 days, clothed in sackcloth. Now, if you figure out those days, a 30-month day, as they have there in Israel, you'll figure out 3.5 years. Now, here's what's going to transpire and take place in those first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. The Antichrist is going to come and make a league with the children of Israel for 7 years. In these 7 years, he's going to start out by seemingly giving them what they ask for, and he's going to have all the answer to our world's dilemmas right now. And then when he gets to and what's going to be going on, these 2 witnesses that I just read about, and I believe these 2 witnesses happen to be Moses and Elijah. Remember, on the Mount of Transfiguration, they were the ones that was transfigured with Jesus. And the description is laid out there in the 11th chapter. If you take time to read it, you see that these 2 men fit into that equation. And I believe that these are the 2 that's going to stand and are going to prophesy, and they're going to preach there in the streets of Jerusalem for 3.5 years. During that 3.5 years, here's what's going to happen. There's going to be 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. 12 12s is 140, and they're going to get saved, and they're going to go out. Read here in the 24th chapter of Matthew. And they're going to do what the church hasn't done in 2,000 years. They're going to go out and actually evangelize the whole known world. The whole world is going to hear about the gospel of the kingdom. Not the gospel of grace that we preach, but the gospel of the kingdom. And in that 144,000 are going to be sealed. Satan and his embassy, they're going to try to destroy them, but they're going to be sealed, and God will not let them be killed. But here's what's going to happen. The Antichrist is going to turn on Israel in the middle of the tribulation. He's going to make a league with them to begin with, but then he's going to literally show himself. Satan, and I wanted to get to this tonight, he's going to be thrown out of heaven. A lot of people think that Satan is already out of heaven, but that's not so. Satan he has access to heaven. You say, wait a moment. How can that be? Well, I'd like to maybe come back to this next week and talk about it. I'll show you how it is to be. But you go back to the book of Job and you read the first 2 chapters, and what was Satan doing? He was going with the sons of, when the sons of God and the sons of men were coming in, the sons of God then were meeting together, the angels. Satan was there with them, and he accused Job, remember? What's Satan doing tonight? Satan is going into, I believe, the presence of God, and he's accusing, according to the book of Revelation, he's accusing the brethren. He's accusing you and me of every slip up that we ever make. He's there in the face of God trying to point out our faults and failures. But I'm going to show you, and I'll come back to this next week and show you how that Satan is going to be expelled from heaven. He's going to come out of heaven, and where's he going to come to? He's already here on earth, but I believe he's back and forth and back. But when Satan, and not only Satan himself, but his false angels are there as well. And they're going to be thrown out of heaven, come down here to this earth, and they're going to make hell here on earth. As much as you could ever imagine. It's going to happen. And it's going to happen during the tribulation period. But here's the good news. The good news is that you and I are not going to be here. Thank God we are not going to suffer the wrath of God. I didn't get to tell you who the tribulation is for and what's it for. The tribulation is to punish Israel. Not punish them, but chastise Israel, because they are the children, they are God's chosen people. But it's also to punish the nations for their sins. I read some of that to you. But thank God, as I said, we as the church are going to be spared, and we're going to be taken out before. And those that believe in that we got to go through the tribulation period, I'm glad I don't have to sleep on that. I'm glad I don't have to worry about that, because as bad as the tribulation is going to be, we're going to be spared. It's going to be the wrath of God that's going to come down mightily and judge the nations of this world, plus punish Israel for what they have done with what God has given them. They rejected his son. They have spurned his love. And they must be brought before the Lord on this. Thank God, many of them, literally the millions of them, I believe, will be saved. I believe there'll be millions saved during the tribulation period, and that's another message for another time, because I just don't have time to get there. But it's an interesting study. I would encourage you to get you some helps. Get into the Bible and find the passages that deal with this all-important subject. Before I quit, let me ask, is there any questions concerning what I've thrown out to you? Bobby come and asked the question last week, is Satan